Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. 7 Turns in a Hangman's Rope by Henry S. Whitehead. I first became acutely aware of the dreadful tragedy of Saul McCartney one sunny morning early in the month of November of the year 1927. On that occasion, instead of walking across the hall from my bathroom after shaving in the early morning shower, I turned to the left upon emerging, and in my bathrobe and slippers went along the upstairs hallway to my workroom on the northwest corner of the house, into which I had just moved, in the west coast town of Frederickstead on the island of Santa Cruz. This pleasant room gave a view through its several windows directly down from the hill on which the house was located, across the pretty town with its red roof and varied colored houses, directly upon the indigo Caribbean. This workroom of mine had a north light from its 2 windows on that side, as I used it only during the mornings. I thus escaped the terrific sun, drenching it, to which, in the absence of any shade without, the room was subjected during the long West Indian afternoon. The occasion for going in there was my desire to see, in the clear morning light, what that ancient oil painting looked like. The canvas which, without its frame, I had tacked up on the south wall the evening before. This trophy, along with various other items of household flotsam and jetsam, had been taken the previous afternoon, which was a day after my arrival on the island, out of a kind of lumber room wherein the owners of the house had plainly been storing for the best part of a century the kind of things which accumulate in a family. Of the considerable amount of material which my houseman Stephen Penn had taken out and stacked and piled in the upper hallway, there happened to be nothing of interest except this good-sized painting, which was about 3 feet by 5 in size. Stephen had paused to examine it curiously, and it was this which drew my attention to it. Under my first cursory examination, which was little more than a glance, I had supposed the thing to be one of those ubiquitous Victorian horrors of reproduction which 50 years ago might have been observed on the walls of most middle-class front parlors, and which were known as chromos. But later that evening, on picking it up and looking at it under the electric light, I found that it was honest paint, and I examined it more closely and with a constantly increasing interest. The painting was obviously the work of a fairly clever amateur. The frame was very old, and dry wood had been riddled through and through by woodworms. It literally fell apart in my hands. I left it there on the floor for Stephen to brush up the next morning, and took the canvas into my bedroom, where there was a better light. The accumulation of many years' dust and crime had served to obscure its once crudely bright coloration. I carried it into my bathroom, made a lather of soap and warm water, and gave it a careful and much-needed cleansing, after which the scene delineated before me assumed a surprising freshness and clarity. After I had dried it off with a hand towel, using great carelessness, I cracked the ancient pigment. I went over it with an oiled cloth. This process really brought it out, and although the canvas was something more than a century old, the long obscured and numerous figures with which it had been almost completely covered seemed once more as bright and clear, and quite as crude, as upon the long-distant day when that rather clever amateur had laid down his, or perhaps her, brush, after putting on the very last dab of vermilion paint. The subject of this old painting, as I recognized quite soon, was an almost forgotten incident in the history of the old Danish West Indies. It had quite obviously been done from the viewpoint of a person on board a ship. Before me, as a setting of the scene, was the well-known harbor of St. Thomas, with its dull red fort at my right, looking exactly as it does today. At the left-hand margin were the edges of various public buildings which have long since been replaced. In the midst, and occupying nearly the entire spread of the canvas, with Government Hill and its fine houses sketched in for background, was shown the execution of Fawcett, the pirate, with his 2 lieutenants, an occasion which had constituted a general holiday for the citizens of St. Thomas, and which had taken place, as I happened to be aware, on the 11th of September, 1825. If the picture had been painted at that time, and it seemed apparent that such was the case, the canvas would be just 102 years old. My interest now thoroughly aroused, I bent over it and examined it with close attention. Then I went into my workroom and brought back my large magnifying glass. My somewhat clever amateur artist had left nothing to the imagination. The picture contained no less than 203 human figures. Of these, only those in the remoter backgrounds were sketched roughly in the modern manner. The actual majority were very carefully depicted with a laborious infinitude of detail, and I suspected then, and since have found every reason to believe, that many, if not most of them, were portraits. There before my eyes were portly Danish worthies of a century ago, with their lady folk, all of whom had come out to see Captain Fawcett died. There were the officers of the garrison, there were the gendarmes of the period, in their stiff-looking uniforms after the manner of Frederick the Great. There were many of the village people, some with large gold rings hanging from one ear, women in their bebustled gingham dresses and bare feet, their foulards or varied-colored head handkerchiefs topped by the broad-brimmed plaited straw hats, which are still to be seen along St. Thomas's concrete drives and sidewalks. There was the executioner, a huge, barely, fierce-looking man with a police master standing beside, and a little behind him, gorgeous in his glistening white drill uniform with its gilt decorations. The 2 stood on the central and largest of the 3 scaffolds. The executioner was naked to the waist and had his woolly head bound up in a tight-fitting scarlet kerchief. He had only that moment sprung the drop, and there at the end of the manila rope, upon which the artist had carefully painted the 7 turns of the traditional hangman's knot placed precisely under the left ear of the miscreant, now receiving the just reward of his innumerable villainies, hung Captain Fawcett himself, the gruesome central figure of this holiday pageant, wearing top boots and a fine plume-colored lace coat. On either side, and from the ropes of the 2 smaller gibbets, dangled those 2 lesser miscreants, Fawcett's mates. Obviously, their several executions, like the preliminary bouts of a modern-day boxing program, had preceded the main event of the day. The 3 gibbets had been erected well to the left of the central space which I have described. The main bulk of the spectators was consequently to the right as one looked at the picture on the fort side. After more than a fascinating hour with my magnifying glass, it being then 11 o'clock and time to turn in, I carried the brittle old canvas into my workroom, and by the rather dim light of the shaded reading lamp, fastened it carefully at a convenient height against the south wall with thumbtacks. The last tack went through the arm of the hanging man nearest the picture's extreme left-hand margin. After accomplishing this, I went to bed. The next morning, as I have mentioned, being curious to see how the thing looked in a suitable light, I walked into the workroom to look at it. I received a devastating shock. My eyes settled after a moment or 2 upon that dangling mate whose body hung from its rope near the extreme left-hand margin of the picture. I found it difficult to believe my eyes. In this clear morning light, the expression of the fellow's face had changed startlingly from what I remembered after looking at it closely through my magnifying glass. Last night it had been merely the face of a man just hanged. I had noted it particularly because, of all the more prominent figures, that face had been most obviously an attempt at exact portraiture. Now it wore a new and unmistakable expression of acute agony, and down the dangling arm, from the point which that last thumbtack had incontinently transfixed, there ran and dripped off the fellow's fingers a stream of bright, fresh red blood. 2. Between the time when the clipper schooner, which had easily overhauled the McCartney trading vessel Hope, coming north across the Caribbean and heavily laden with sacked coffee from Barranquilla, had sent a challenging shot from its swivel guns across the Hope's bows, and is accomplishing the maneuver of coming about in obedience to that unmistakable summons, Captain Saul McCartney had definitely decided what policy he should follow. He had made numerous voyages in the Hope among the bustling trade ports of the Caribbean and to and from his own home port of St. Thomas, and never before, by the grace of God and the McCartney luck, had any free trader called upon him to stand and deliver on the high seas. But like all seafaring men of Captain McCartney's generation, plying to trade in those latitudes in the early 1820s, he was well aware of what was now in store for him. His father's ship and the members of his crew, the Hope, would be looted, then probably scuttled, in accordance with the free traders' well-nigh universal policy of destroying every scrap of evidence against them. As for himself and his men, they would be confronted with a formula: join or go over the side. A pirate's recruit was a pirate, at once involved in a status which was without the law. His evidence, even if he were attempting the dangerous double game of merely pretending to join his captor, was worthless. There was one possible ray of hope, direct resistance being plainly out of the question. This might be one of the better established freebooters, a piratical captain, and following whose notoriety was already so widespread, who was already so well known, that he would not take the trouble to destroy the Hope, or beyond the usual offer made to all volunteers of a piratical crew, constantly in need of such replacements, to put the captured vessel officers and crew through the mill, once they were satisfied that there was nothing aboard this latest prize to repay them for the trouble and risk of capture and destruction. The Hope, laden almost to her gunwales with sacked coffee, would provide lean pickings for a free trader, despite the value of her bulk cargo in a legitimate port of trade like Savannah or Norfolk. There were cases, known to Captain McCartney, where a piratical outfit under the command of some notables such as Edward Thatch, often called Teach or Blackbeard, or England, or Fawcett, or Jacob Brenner, had merely sheered off and sailed away in search of more desirable game, as soon as it was plain that the loot was neither easily portable nor of the type of value represented by bullion, silks, or the strong box of some inter-island trading supercargo. It was plain enough to Captain Saul McCartney, whose vessel had been stopped here about a day's sail southwest of his home port of St. Thomas, capital of the Danish West Indies, and whose cargo was intended for delivery to several ships' brokerage houses in that clearinghouse port for the vast West Indian shipping trade, that his marauder of the high seas could do nothing with his coffee. These ideas were very prominent in his mind in the interval between his shouted orders in the subsequent period during which the Hope, her way slacking rapidly, hung in the air, her jibs, booms, and loose rigging slapping angrily, while the many boats from the free trading vessel were slung outboard in a very brisk and workmanlike manner, and dropped one after the other into the waters alongside until everyone, 7 in all, had been launched. These boats were so heavily manned as to leave them very low in the water. Now the oars moved with an almost delicate precision, as though the rowers feared some mischance even in that placid sea. The Hope's officers and crew, all of them crowding along the vessel's starboard rail, the mates quiet and collected as men taking their cue from the superior officer, the crew goggle-eyed, chattering in low tones among themselves in groups and knots, motivated by the sudden looming terror which showed in a great tinge upon their skins. Then, in a strident whisper from the first mate, a shrewd and experienced bucko, hailing originally from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, wise in the ways of these tropical latitudes from 20 years' continuous seafaring. God, it's Fawcett himself! Slowly, deliberately, as though extremely disdainful of any possible resistance, the 7 boats drew towards the doomed Hope. The 2 foremost edged in closer alongside her starboard quarter, and threw small grapples handily from bows and stern, and so hung it under the Hope's lee. Captain Saul McCartney, cupping his hands, addressed over the heads of the intervening 6 boatloads, the man seated in the stern sheets of the outermost boat. "Cargo of sacked Brazil coffee, Captain, and nothing else to make it worth your while to come aboard me, if you'll take my word for it. That's the fact, sir, so help me God." In silence from all hands in the boats, and without any immediate reply from Fawcett, this piece of information was received. Captain Fawcett sat there at the stern sheets of his longboats, erect, silent, presumably pondering what Captain Saul McCartney had told him. He sat there, calm and unruffled, a fine gold-laced tricorn hat on his head, which, together with the elegance of his wine-colored English broadcloth coat, threw into sharp relief his brutal, unshaven face, with his sinister, shining white scar, the result of an old cutlass wound, which ran diagonally from the upper corner of his left ear forward down the cheek across both lips, clear to the edge of his prominent chin. Fawcett, the pirate, ended his reflective interval. He raised his head, rubbed a soiled hand through his beard stubble, and spat outboard. "Any ship's biscuit left aboard ye?" he inquired, turning his eyes along the Hope's freeboard and thence contemplatively about her masts and rigging. "We're short." "I've plenty, Captain. Will it answer if I have it passed over the side to you?" The 2 vessels and the 7 heavily laden boats lay tossing silently in the gentle swell. Not a sound broke the tension, while Captain Fawcett appeared to deliberate. Then a second time he spat over the side of his longboat and rubbed his black, stubbly chin with his hand reflectively. Then he looked across his boats directly at Captain Saul McCartney. The ghost of a sour grin broke momentarily the grim, straight line of his maimed and cruel mouth. "I'll be coming aboard you, Captain," he said very slowly, "if you have no objection to make." A bellow of laughter at this sally of their captain's rose from the huddled pirate crew in the boats and broke the mounting tension. A man at the Hope's rail cackled hysterically, and a chorus of jibes at this arose from the motley crew of the 2 boats grappled alongside. In the silence which followed, Captain Fawcett muttered a curt, monosyllabic order. The other 5 boats closed in without haste, 2 of them passing around the Hope's stern and another around her bow. It was only a matter of a few seconds before the entire 7 hung along the Hope's sides, like feasting wolves upon the flanks of a stricken deer. Then, at a second brief order, the crews came over the rails quietly and in good order, Fawcett himself arriving last upon the Hope's deck. No resistance of any kind was offered. Captain McCartney had had the word pass quietly on that score, while the pirates' boats were being slung into the water. After the bustling scramble involved in nearly 100 men climbing over the Hope's rails from the 7 boats, and which was despite the excellent order maintained, a maneuver involving considerable noisy activity, another and even a more ominous silence settled down upon the belaggard Hope. Supported by his 2 mates, one of whom was a small, neat, carefully dressed fellow, and the other an enormous German who sported a cavalryman's mustache and walked truculently, Captain Fawcett proceeded directly aft, where he turned and faced forward, a mate on either side of him, and leaned against the superstructure of Captain McCartney's cabin. McCartney's mates, taking patterns from this procedure, walked over from the rail and flanked him, where he stood just aft of the Hope's foremast. The rest of the freebooters, having apparently been left free by their officers to do as they pleased for the time being, strolled about the deck, looking over the vessel's superficial equipment, and then gathered in little knots and groups about the 11 other members of the Hope's crew. Through this intermingling, the comparative silence which had followed their coming aboard began to be dissipated with raillery, various low-voiced sallies of crude wit at the expense of the Hope's crew, and an occasional burst of nervous or raucous laughter. All this, however, was carried on as Captain McCartney took it in what was to him an unexpectedly restrained and quiet manner, utterly at variance with the reputed conduct of such a group of abandoned villains at sea, and to him at least, convincing evidence that something sinister was in the wind. This expectation had its fulfillment at a harsh blast from the whistle which, at Fawcett's nod, the huge German mate had taken from his pocket and blown. Instantly the pirates closed in and seized those members of the Hope's crew who stood nearest them, several, sometimes 5 or 6, men crowding in to overpower each individual. 5 or 6 of the pirates who had been, as though without purpose, near the forward hatchway, which led below decks, began forthwith to knock out the wedges. The Hope's crew, with a unanimity which bespoke the excellent discipline and strategy which Fawcett was generally understood to maintain, were hustled forward and thrust into the forecastle, the hatch of which, as soon as they were all inside, was forthwith closed tight and at once nailed fast by the undersized little Englishman who was Fawcett's ship's carpenter. None of the Hope's crew had been harmed. None seemed to Captain McCartney to have been even slightly injured in the course of this rough and effective handling. Captain McCartney surmised, and rightly, that the pirates' intention was to preserve them alive either for ultimate sale into slavery, which was of course then extant throughout the West Indies islands, or perhaps to convey them as shore servants to Fawcett's settlements, which, it was generally believed, was well in the interior of the island of Andros in the Bahamas group, where a network of interlacing creeks rendering anything like pursuit and capture well nigh out of the question had made this private fastness a stronghold. But Captain McCartney had little time to waste thinking over the fate of his crew. With perhaps a shade less of the roughness with which the crew had been seized, he and his mates were almost simultaneously surrounded and marched aft to face their captors. It seemed plain that the usual choice was to be given only to the 3 of them. Fawcett did not hesitate this time. He looked at the 3 men standing before him, lowered his head, relaxed his burly figure, and barked out, "You'll join me, or go over the side." He pointed a dirty finger almost directly into the face of the older mate, who stood at his captain's right hand. "You first," he barked again. "Name your choice, and name it now." The hard-bitten New Hampshire Yankee stood true to the traditions of an honest sailorman. "To hell with you, you damn scalawag," he drawled, and spat on the deck between Captain Fawcett's feet. There could be but one reply on that part of a man of Fawcett's heady character to such an insult as this. With a speed that baffled the eye, the great pistol which hung from the right side of his belt beneath the flap of his fine broadcloth coat was snatched free, and to the accompaniment of its tearing bore, its huge ball smote through the luckless Yankee's forehead. As the acrid smoke blew from the detonation, Captain McCartney observed the huge German mate lifting the limp body, which, as though it had been that of a child, he carried in great strides to near a rail and heaved overboard. Fawcett pointed with his smoking weapon at McCartney's other mate, a small-built fellow, originally a British subject from the island of Antigua. The mate merely nodded comprehendingly. Then, "The same as Elias Perkins told you, you blasted swab, and may you rot deep in hell." But Fawcett's surly humor appeared to have evaporated, to have discharged itself in the pistoling of the other man whose scattered brains had left an ugly smear on the Hope's clean deck. He merely laughed, and with a comprehensive motion of his left hand, addressed the larger of his mates, who had resumed his position at his left. "Take him, Franz," he ordered. The huge mate launched himself upon the Antiguan like a ravening beast. With lightning-like rapidity, his enormous left arm coiled crushingly about the doomed man's neck. Simultaneously, his open right hand against his victim's forehead, he pushed mightily. The little Antiguan spine yielded with an audible crack, and his limp body slithered loosely to the deck. Then, with a sweeping, contemptuous motion, the huge mate grasped the limp form in one hand, lifting it by the front of the waistcoat and whirling about, hurled it with a mighty pitch far outboard. The German mate had not yet resumed his place beside Fawcett when Captain Saul McCartney addressed the pirate leader. "I'm joining you, Captain," he said quietly. And while the surprised Fawcett stared at him, the newly enlisted freebooter, who had been Captain Saul McCartney of the schooner Hope, with a motion which did not suffer by comparison with Fawcett's for its swiftness, had produced a long dirk, taking the 2 lightning strides necessary for an effective stroke, and had plunged his weapon with a mighty upward thrust from under the ribs through the German mate's heart. Withdrawing it instantly, he stooped over the sprawled body and wiped the dirk's blade in a nonchalant and leisurely manner on the dead ruffian's fine cambric shirt frill, As he proceeded to this task, he turned his head upward and slightly to the left and looked squarely in the eye the stultified pirate captain, who stood motionless and staring in his surprise at this totally unexpected feat of his newest recruit. From his crouching position, Saul McCartney spoke quietly and without emphasis. "You see, sir, I dislike this larrikin from the minute I clapped eyes on him. And I'll call your attention to the fact that I'm a sound navigator and," Saul McCartney smiled and showed his handsome teeth, "I'll ask your notice preliminary to my acting with you, that it might equally well have been yourself that I scragged. And perhaps that'll serve to teach you the manner of man that you're now taking as an active lieutenant." Then Saul McCartney, his bantering smile gone now, his McCartney mouth set in a grim line, his clenched dirk held ready in his sound right hand, stood menacingly before Captain Fawcett, their breasts almost touching in a quarter-deck voiced inquire. "And will you be taking it or leaving it, Captain Fawcett?" 3. It was more than 2 months later when the Hope, her hull now painted a shining black, her topmost lengthened all round by 6 feet, her spread of canvas vastly increased, 8 carronade ports newly cut along her sides, and renamed the Swallow, entered the harbor of St. Thomas, dropped her anchor, and sent over her side a narrow longboat. Into this boat, immediately after its crew of 6 oarsmen had settled down upon their thwarts and laid their 6 long sweeps out upon the harbor water, interested onlookers observed 2 officers descend over the Swallow's side, where they occupied the stern sheets together. As the boat rowed man-of-war style rapidly approached the wharves, it was observed by those on shore that the 2 men seated astern were rather more than handsomely dressed. The shorter and heavier man wore a fine sprigged long coat of English broadcloth with lapels, and a lace tricorn hat. His companion, whose appearance had about it something vaguely familiar, was arrayed in an equally rich and very well-tailored, though somewhat plainer coat of a medium blue, which set off his handsome figure admirably. This person wore no hat at all, nor any shade for his head against the glare of the 11 o'clock sun, save a heavy crop of carefully arranged and naturally curly hair, as black as a crow's wing. So interesting indeed to the loungers along the wharves had been the entrance of this previously unknown vessel into the harbor and the subsequent coming ashore of these 2 fine gentlemen, that a considerable knot of sightseers was already assembled on the particular jetty toward which the longboat, smartly rowed, came steadily closer and closer. The hatless gentleman, who was by far the taller and handsomer of the 2, appeared to be steering the taut tiller ropes, held firmly in his large and very shapely hands. It was the Herr Rudolph Byrne, who had observed the crowd collecting on the jetty through the open windows of his airy shipping office close at hand, and who had clapped on his pith sun helmet and hastened to join the group, who was the first to recognize this taller officer. "Good God! It's Herr Captain Saul McCartney. Good God! How they will be rejoiced! Old McCartney and the Miss Camilla!" Within 5 minutes, the rapidly approaching longboat had been laid aside the pier head and navy style. Without any delay, the 2 gentlemen whose advent had so greatly interested the St. Thomas harbor watchers stepped ashore with an air of and mounted the jetty steps side by side. At once Saul McCartney, whose fine clothes so well became him, forged ahead of his well-dressed, shaved, and curled companion. He wore the dazzling smile which revealed his magnificent teeth, and which had served to disarm every woman upon whom it had been consciously turned since his 8th year or thereabouts. Like a conquering hero, this handsome young man, who had taken clearance from the South American port of Barranquilla nearly 3 months before, and subsequently disappeared into thin air along with his vessel, and all the hands off the face of the waters, now stepped jauntily across the jetty towards the welcoming group, whose numbers were, now that the news of his homecoming was beginning to trickle through the town, constantly increasing. He was instantaneously surrounded by these welcoming acquaintances, who sought each to outdo his neighbor in the enthusiastic fervency of his congratulatory greetings. During this demonstration, the redoubtable and notorious Captain Fawcett stood quietly looking on throughout its milling course, a sardonic smile faintly relieving the crass repulsiveness of his maimed countenance. The pirate had been shaved to the blood that morning, dressed for the occasion with the greatest care. His carefully arranged locks were redolent of the oil of bergamot, filched a week before out of the accessories of a lady's passenger, taken from the luckless vessel on which she had been coming out to the West Indies to join her planter husband. This lady had, after certain passing attentions from Saul McCartney, gone over the Swallow's side in plain sight of the volcanic cone of Nevis, the island of her destination. That McCartney's had brought Captain Fawcett ashore with him here in St. Thomas was a piece of judgment so lamentably bad as to need no comment of any kind. His doing so initiated that swift course of events which brought down upon his handsome head that ruinous doom which stands probably as unique among the annals of retribution, that devastating doom which, for its horror and its strangeness, transcends and surpasses in all human probability even the direst fate which in this old world's long history may have taken over any of the other sons of men. But the sheer effrontery of that act was utterly characteristic of Saul McCartney. In the course of the long, painstaking, and probably exhaustive research which I, Gerald Canavan, set in motion in order to secure the whole range of facts forming the basis of this narrative, an investigation which has extended through more than 3 years and has taken me down some very curious bypaths of antique West Indian history, as well as into contact with various strange characters and around a few very alluring corners of research, one aspect of the whole affair stands out in my mind most prominently. This is the fact that, as those many who nowadays increasingly rely for guidance upon the once discredited but now reviving science of astrology would phrase it, Saul McCartney was in all ways a typical Sagittarian. One of the more readily accessible facts which I looked up out of ancient musty records in the course of this strange affair was the date of his birth. He had been born in the city of St. Thomas on the 28th of November in the year 1795. He was thus 29 in his 30th year and the full vigor of his manhood at the time when Captain Fawcett had captured the Hope, and having lightened that vessel by emptying her hold of her cargo, which he consigned to the sea, and having scuttled his own disabled vessel, had sailed for his home base among the Andros Creeks. From there, a month later, the transformed Swallow had emerged to maraud upon the Spanish Main. He was not yet out of his 20s when he had chosen to tempt fate by coming ashore with Fawcett in St. Thomas. He was still short of 30 when a certain fateful day dawned in the month of September, 1825. True to this hypothetical horoscope of his and to every sidereal circumstance accompanying it, Saul McCartney was an entirely self-centered person. With him, the main chance had always been paramount. It was this addiction to the main chance which had caused him to join Fawcett. A similar motive had actuated him in the notable coup which, at once because of its sheer directness and the courage involved in it, established him in the high esteem of the pirate captain. There had been no sentiment in his killing of the gigantic mate, Franz. He was not thinking of avenging his own faithful lieutenant, whom that hulking beast had slain with his bare hands. Before his eyes, a moment before, he had knifed the murderer. His calculating sense of self-interest had been the whole motive behind the act. He could quite as easily have destroyed Fawcett himself, as he characteristically pointed out to that ruffian. He would have done so with equal ruthlessness, save for his knowledge of the fact that he would have been overwhelmed immediately thereafter by Fawcett's underlings. There is very little question but what he would have before very long succeeded to the command of the Swallow and the control of the considerable commerce and slave trade and other similar illegitimate sources of revenue which went with the command of this piratical enterprise. He had already inaugurated the replacement of Captain Fawcett by himself in the esteem of that freebooter's numerous following, well before the refurbished Swallow had sailed proudly out upon her current voyage. His unquestionable courage and enormous gift of personality had already been for some time combining actively to impress the pirate crew. Among them he was already a dominating figure. Since well before he had attained manly maturity, he had been irresistible to women. He was a natural fighter who loved conflict for its own sake. His skill with weapons was well nigh phenomenal. In the prosecution of every affair which concerned his own benefit, he had always habituated himself to going straight to the mark. He was, in short, as it might be expressed, both with respect to women and the securing of his own advantage in general affairs, thoroughly spoiled by an unbroken course of getting precisely what he wanted. This steady impact of continuous success and the sustained parallel effect of unceasing feminine admiration had entrenched in his character the fatal conviction that he could do as he pleased in every imaginable set of conditions. The first reversal suffered in that unbroken course of selfish domination inaugurated itself not very long after he had stepped ashore with Captain Fawcett behind him. After 10 minutes or so, McCartney gradually got to himself free from the crowd of friends, congratulating him there on the jetty. Stimulated as he always was by such admiration, highly animated, his Irish blue eyes flashing, his smile unabated, his selfish heart full to repletion of his accustomed self-confidence, he disentangled himself from the still increasing crowd, and with several bows and various wavings of his left hand, as he backed away from them, he rejoined Fawcett, linked his right arm through the crooks of the captain's left elbow, and proceeded to conduct him into town. Those fellows on the wharf were small fry. He would, as he smilingly mentioned in Fawcett's ear, prefer to introduce the captain at once into a gathering place where he would meet a group of gentlemen of great importance. They walked up into the town and turned to the left through the bustling traffic of its chief thoroughfare, and proceeding to the westward for a couple of 100 feet or so, turned in through a wide arched doorway above which, on its bracket, perched guardian-like small gilded rooster. This was Le Coq d'Or, rendezvous of the more prosperous merchants of the flourishing city of St. Thomas. A considerable amount of these prosperous worthies were already assembled at the time of their arrival in Le Coq d'Or. Several men under the direction of the steward of this club-like clearinghouse were already bringing in and placing on the huge polished mahogany table the planter's punch, swizzles of brandy or rum, and sangaree such as always accompanied this late morning assembly. It lacked only a little minute or two of 11, and the stroke of that hour was sacred in Le Coq d'Or, and similar foregatherings places as a swizzle hour. No less a personage than Monsieur Daniel, some years before a refugee from the Haitian Revolution, and now a merchant prince here in the Danish colonial capital, was already twirling a carved swizzle stick in the fragrant, iced interior of an enormous silver jug. But this hospitable activity, as well as innumerable conversations currently about the board, ceased abruptly when these city burghers had recognized the tall, handsome gentleman in blue broadcloth who had just stepped in among them. It was indeed practically a repetition of what had occurred on the jetty, save that here the corporate and individual greetings were, if anything, more intimate and more vociferous. Here were the natural associates, the intimates, the social equals of the McCartneys themselves, a well-to-do clan of proud, self-respecting personages deriving from the class of Irish Protestant high gentry which had come into these islands 3 generations before upon the invitation of the Danish colonial government. Among those who rose out of their chairs to surround Saul McCartney with hilarious greetings was Dennis McCartney, his father. He had expected that the old man would be there. The two clasped each other in a long and affectionate embrace. Dennis McCartney, tearful, his son smiling, with an unforced whimsicality throughout the intensive contact of this reunion. At last the old man, his tears of happiness still overflowing, held off and gazed fondly at his handsome, strapping son, a pair of still trembling hands upon the shoulders of the beautiful new broadcloth coat. "And where, in God's name, have you hidden yourself away, my boy?" he asked solicitously. The others, grouped about, and now fallen silent, hovered about the edges of the demonstration, the universal West Indian courtesy only restraining their common enthusiasm to clasp the McCartney prodigal by his bronzed and shapely hands, to thump his back, to place kindly arms about his broad shoulders, later to thrust brimming goblets of cut crystal upon him that they might drink his health and generously toast his safe and unexpected return. "I'll tell you about that later, sir," said Saul McCartney, his dazzling smile lighting up his bronzed face. "You'll understand, sir, my anxiety to see Camilla, though, of course, I looked in upon you first off. and thereupon, in his sustained bravado, in the buoyancy of his fatal conviction that he, Saul McCartney, could get away with anything whatever he might choose to do, and taking full advantage of the disconcerting effect of his announcement that he must run off, he turned to Captain Fawcett, who had been standing close behind him, and, an arm about the captain's shoulder, presented him formally to his father, to Monsieur Daniel, and with a comprehensive wave of his disengaged arm, to the company at large, and forthwith, well before the inevitable effect of this could record itself upon the corporate minds of such a group, Saul McCartney had whirled about, reached the arched doorway almost at a run, and disappeared in the blinding glare on his way to call upon his cousin Camilla. The group of gentlemen assembled in Le Coq d'Or that morning, intensely preoccupied as they had been with the unexpected restoration to their midst of the missing mariner, McCartney had barely observed the person who had accompanied him. They were now rather abruptly left facing their new guest, and their immediate reaction after McCartney's hasty departure was to stage a greeting for this very evil-looking but highly dandified fellow whom they found in their midst. To this they proceeded forthwith. Actuated primarily by the unfailing and highly developed courtesy which has always been the outstanding characteristic of the Lesser Antilles, there was not a man present who had not winced at the name which Saul McCartney had so clearly pronounced in the course of his threefold introduction of Captain Fawcett. For this name, as that of one of the principal maritime scourges of the day, was indeed very familiar to these men, attuned as they were to seafaring matters. Several of them, in fact, vessel owners, had actually been sufferers at the hands of this man, who now sat among them. Courtesy, however, and to a guest in this central sanctum, came first. Despite their initial suspicion, by no single overt act, nor by so much as a single glance did any member of that polished company allow it to be suspected that he had at least given harbourage to the idea the Saul McCartney had brought Fawcett, the pirate, here to Le Coq d'Or, and left him among them as a guest. Besides, doubtless it occurred to each and every one of these excellent gentlemen, apart from the impossibility of such a situation being precipitated by anyone named McCartney, which was an additional loophole for them, the name of Fawcett was by no means an uncommon one. There might well be half a dozen Fawcetts on Lloyd's list who were or had been commanders of ships. It was of course possible that this overdressed, tough-looking Seahawk had fooled the usually astute Saul. As for Fawcett himself, the wolf among these domestic cattle, he was enjoying the situation vastly. The man was intelligent and shrewd, still capable of drawing about him the remnants of a genteel deportment, and as the details of his projected coming ashore here had been quite fully discussed with Saul McCartney, he had anticipated and was quite well prepared to meet the reaction released at the first mention of that hated and dreaded name of his, in which he now plainly sensed all about him. There was probably even a touch of pride over what his nefarious reputation could evoke in a group like this, to nerve him for the curious ordeal which had now begun for him. It was, of course, his policy to play quietly a conservative and almost negative role. He busied now his always alert mind with this, returning courtesy for courtesy, and his host toasted him formally, assured him of their welcome, exchanged with him those general remarks which precede any real breaking of the ice between an established group and some unknown and untried newcomer. It was old McCartney who gave him his chief stimulation by inquiring, "And what of me dear son, Captain? You will have been in his company for some time, it may be. It would be more than gracious of you to relate to us, if so be you are aware of it, perchance, what occurred to him on that last voyage of his from South America." At this really unexpected query, the entire room fell silent. Every gentleman present restrained his own speech as though a signal had been given. Only the servants, intent upon their duties, continued to speak to each other under their breaths, and to move soft-footedly about the room. Captain Fawcett recognized at once that Mr. Dennis McCartney's question contained no challenge. He had even anticipated it with a thin yarn of shipwreck which he and Saul had concocted together. In a sudden access of whimsical bravado, he abandoned this cooked-up tale. He would give them a story. He turned with an elaborate show of courtesy to old McCartney. He set down his half-empty goblet, paused, wiped his maimed mouth with a fine cambric handkerchief, and set himself in the breathless silence all about him to reply. "The free traders took him, sir," said Captain Fawcett. Then he nodded twice, deprecatingly. Next he waved a hand, took up his goblet, again drank off its remaining contents in the sustained pregnant silence, and again turned to Saul's father. Settling himself somewhat more comfortably in his chair, he then proceeded to relate, with precise circumstantial detail, exactly what had actually taken place, only substituting it for himself as the captor the name of the dreaded Jacob Brenner, who, like himself, had a place of refuge among the Andros Creeks, and whom Captain Fawcett regarded with profound and bitter detestation as his principal rival. He told his story, threw in the atmosphere of intense interest all about him. He made Captain Saul McCartney pretend to join the cutthroat Brenner, and, the wish greatly followed to the thought, brought his long yarn to a successful conclusion, with the doughty Saul staging a desperate hand-to-hand encounter with his captor after going ashore with him on Andros Island, together with a really artistic sketching in of his escape from the pirate settlement in a dinghy through the intricacies of the mosquito-infested creeks, and his ultimate harborage, well nigh by chance or trace of what he names the McCartney luck, sir, with himself. "I've a very pleasant little spot there on Andros," added Captain Fawcett. Then, satisfying another accession of his whimsicality, "I'm certain any of you would be pleased with it, gentlemen. It's been good, very good and pleasurable, I do assure you, to have had Captain McCartney with me." And Fawcett, the pirate, whose own longboat had fetched him ashore here from that very vessel whose capture by free traders on the high seas he had just been so graphically recounted, with a concluding short bow and a flourish of his left hand, took up his recently replenished crystal goblet, and again facing the senior McCartney, toasted him roundly on this, the glad occasion of his seafaring son's prosperous return. Saul McCartney walked rapidly across the crowded main thoroughfare, so as to avoid being recognized, and stopped. He turned up the precipitous, winding, and abruptly cornered streets of varying widths, and following it between the many closed-walled residences, among which it wound, mounted at a rapid stride to a point 2/3 of the way up the hill. Here he paused to readjust his clothes, and finally to wipe the sweat induced by his pace from his bronzed face with another fine cambric handkerchief, like that being used by his colleague about this time down there at Le Coq d'Or. The two of them had divided evenly 4 dozen of these handkerchiefs not long before, from the effects of a dandified French supercargo now feeding the fishes. It was a very sultry day in the middle of the month of May, in that spring period when the rada drums of the villagers may be heard booming nightly from the wooded hills in the interior of the islands. Then the annual shift in the direction of the trade wind between the points east and west of north seems to hang a curtain of sultriness over St. Thomas on its 3 hillsides. It was one of those days when the burros' tongues hang out of dry mouths as they proceed along dusty roads, when centipedes leave their native dust and boldly cross the floors of houses, when ownerless dogs slink along the inner edges of the baking narrow sidewalks in the slits of house shade away from the sun. Saul McCartney had paused near the entrance to the spacious mansion of his uncle, Thomas Lanigan McCartney, which stood behind a stately grille of wrought iron 11 feet high. In its own grounds, it was approached through a wide gateway, above which the cut stone arch supported a plaque on which had been carved the McCartney arms. Through this imposing entrance, his face now comfortably dry, and his fine broadcloth coat readjusted to his entire satisfaction, Saul McCartney now entered and proceeded along the broad, shell-strewn path with its 2 borders of cemented pink conch shells toward the mansion. Throughout the accident of being his father's firstborn son, and the rigid application of the principle of primogeniture which had always prevailed among the McCartney clan in the matter of inheritance, old T.L. McCartney possessed the bulk of the solid McCartney family fortune. He had married the only daughter of a retired Danish general who had been governor of the colony. Dying in office, the general had left behind him the memory of a sound administration and another substantial fortune, which found its way through the connection into the McCartney coffers. The only reason why Saul McCartney had not led his heavily endowed cousin Camilla to the altar long before was merely because he knew he could marry her any time. Camilla's lips had parted, and her blue eyes became mysterious, soft, and melting at every sight of him since about the time she was 8 and he 10. As for Saul McCartney, he could not remember the time when it had not been his settled intention to marry his cousin Camilla when he got ready. He was as sure of her as of the rising and setting of the sun, as that failure was a word without meaning to him, as that the Santa Cruz rum was and always would be the natural drink of gentlemen and sailors. Jens Sorensen, the butler, who had witnessed his arrival, had the door open with a flourish when Saul was halfway between the gate and the gallery. His bow, as his favored guest entered the house, was profound enough to strain the seams of his green broadcloth livery coat. But Jens received no reward for his assiduousness from the returned prodigal beyond a nod. This was not like Saul in the least. But Jens understood perfectly why Captain McCartney had not quizzed him, paused to slap mightily his broad back under his green coat, or to tweak the lobe of his right ear ornamented with its heavy ring of virgin gold, all of which attentions Jens could ordinarily expect from this fine gentleman of his family's close kinfolk. There had been no time for such persiflage. For hardly had Jens' huge, soft right hand begun the motion of closing the great door, when Camilla McCartney, apprised by some subtlety of the grapevine route of her cousin's arrival, appeared on the threshold of the mansion's great drawing-room. Her lips parted, her eyes suffused with an inescapable emotion. Only momentarily she paused there. Then she was running towards him across the polished mahogany flooring of the wide hallway, and had melted into the firm clasp of Saul McCartney's brawny arms. Raising her head, she looked up into his face adoringly, and Saul, responding, bent and kissed her long and tenderly. No sound save the occasioned by the soft-footed retirement of Jens to his pantry broke the cool silence of the dignified hall. Then at last, in a voice from Camilla McCartney that was a little above a whisper, Saul, my darling, I am so glad, so glad. You will tell me all that transpired later, Saul, my dear. Oh, it has been a dreadful time for me. Withdrawing herself very gently from his embrace, she turned, and before the great Copenhagen mirror against the hallway's south wall, made a small readjustment in her coiffure. Her hair was of the purest, cleanest Scandinavian gold, of a spun silk fineness. Beckoning her lover to follow, she then led the way into the mansion's drawing-room. As they entered Camilla, a step in advance of McCartney, there arose from a mahogany and rose satin davenport the thick-set figure of a handsome young man of about 24, arrayed in the scarlet coat of His Britannic Majesty's Line Regiment of Infantry. This was Captain the Honourable William Macmillan, who, as a freshly commissioned cornet of horse, had actually fought under Wellington at Waterloo 10 years before. Recently he had attained his captaincy and sold out to undertake here and the Danish West Indies the resident management of a group of Santa Crucian sugar estates, the property of his Scottish kinsfolk, the Commons. These two personable captains, one so called because of his courtesy title, and the other with that honourable seafaring title really forfeited, were duly represented to each other by Camilla McCartney, and thereby was consummated another long stride forward in the rapid march of Saul McCartney's hovering doom. The Scottish officer, sensing Saul's claim upon that household, retired erelong with precisely the correct degree of formality. As soon as he was safely out of earshot, Camilla McCartney rose and, seizing a small hassock, placed it near her cousin's feet. Seating herself upon this, she looked up adoringly into his face, and her whole soul in her eyes begged him to tell her what had happened since the day when he had cleared the Hope from Barranquilla. Again Saul McCartney rushed forward upon his fate. He told her, with circumstantial detail, the cooked-up story of shipwreck, including a touching piece of invention about 3 days and nights on the Hope's boats, and his timely rescue by his new friend Fawcett, master of the Swallow, a very charitable gentleman, proprietor of a kind of trading station on Andros in the Bahamas. Captain Fawcett, who had considerately brought the prodigal back to St. Thomas, was at the moment being entertained in the Coque d'Or. Camilla McCartney's eyes grew wide at the name of Saul's rescuer. The first intimation of her subsequent change of attitude began with her exclamation, Saul. Not Captain Fawcett the pirate. Not that dreadful man. I had always understood that his lying-up place was in the island of Anjos, among the creeks. Saul McCartney lied easily, reassuringly. He turned upon his cousin, anxious now, as he could see, and troubled. The full battery of his engaging personality. He showed those beautiful teeth of his in a smile that would have melted the heart of a Galatia. Camilla dropped the subject, entered upon a long explanation of her happiness, her delight at having him back. He must remain for breakfast. Was his friend and benefactor, Captain Fawcett, suitably housed? He might, of course, stay here. Father would be so delighted at having him. It was as though she was attempting subconsciously to annihilate her first faint doubt of her cousin, Saul, in the enthusiasm for his rescuer. She rose and ran across the room and jerked violently upon the ornamental bell rope. In almost immediate response to her ring, Jens entered the room, softly bowed before his mistress with a suggestion of prostrating himself. A place for Captain McCartney at the breakfast table. Champagne, 4 of the 1801 Chablis. Is Miranda along with his shell crustadas? Again, Camilla McCartney was reassured. All these commands would be precisely carried out. Thereafter, for a space indeed, until the noon breakfast was announced, conversation languished between the cousins. For the first time in his life, had Saul McCartney been to the slightest degree critical and observant, he would have detected in Camilla's bearing a vague hint that her mind towards him was not wholly at rest. But of this he noticed nothing, as always, and especially now, under the stimulation of this curious game of bravado he and Fawcett were playing here in St. Thomas. No warning, no sort of premonition had penetrated the thick veneer of his selfishness, his fatuous conviction that any undertaking of his must necessarily proceed to a successful outcome. He sat there thinking of how well he had managed things, of the chances of the Swallow's next adventure on the main, of the ripe physical beauty of Camilla, of various women here in town. And Camilla McCartney, beautiful, strangely composed, exquisitely dressed as always, sat straight, upright, across from him, and looked steadily at her cousin, Saul McCartney. It was as though she envisaged vaguely how he was to transform her love into black hatred. A thin shadow of pain lay across her own Irish blue eyes. Captain the Honorable William Macmillan, like many other personable young gentlemen before him, had been very deeply impressed with the quality of Camilla McCartney. But it was not only that West Indian gentlewoman's social graces and cool blonde beauty that were responsible for the favorable impression. The young captain, a thoroughly hard-headed Scot, with very much more behind his handsome forehead than the necessary knowledge of military tactics possessed by the ordinary line regiment officer, had been even more deeply impressed by other qualities obviously possessed by his West Indian hostess. Among these was her intellect, unusually thought in a colonial lady not yet quite 28. Nothing like Miss McCartney's control of the many servants of the household had ever seemed possible to the captain. From Jens the butler to the third scullery maid, all of them, as they came severally under the notice of this guest, appeared to accord her a reverence hardly distinguishable from acts of worship. In going about the town with her, either walking for early evening exercise or in her father's barouche to make or return formal calls, the trained and observant eye of the young Scotsman had not failed to notice her effect upon the swarming population of the town. Obedience from those marked her passage among them. The gay stridency of the street conversations lulled itself, and was still at her passing. Doffed hats, bows, veritable obedience in rows and by companies, swayed these street loiterers as her moving about among them left them hushed and worshipful in her wake. Captain Macmillan noted the very general respectful attitude of the villagers towards their overlords, but his eyes told him plainly they appeared to regard Camilla McCartney as a kind of divinity. In the reasonable desire to satisfy his mounting curiosity, Captain Macmillan had broached this subject to his hostess. A canny Scot, he had approached the matter indirectly. His initial questions had to do with native manners and customs, always a safe general topic in a colony. Camilla's direct answers had at once surprised him with their clarity and the exactitude of their information. It was unusual and, as the subject broadened out between them and Camilla, told him more about the villagers, their beliefs, their manners of life, their customs and practices, it began to be plain to Captain Macmillan that it was more than unusual if someone entitled to do so had asked him his opinion on Camilla McCartney's grasp of this rather esoteric subject, and the captain had answered freely and frankly, he would have been obliged to admit that it seemed to him uncanny. For behind those social graces of hers, which made Camilla McCartney a notable figure in the polite society of this Danish colonial capital, apart from the distinction of her family connection, her commanding position as the richest heiress in the colony, her knowledge, intellectual attainments, and the distinguished beauty of face and form, which lent a pervading graciousness to her very act, Camilla McCartney was almost wholly occupied by two consuming interests. Of these, the first, generally known by every man, woman, and child in St. Thomas, was her preoccupation with her cousin Saul McCartney. The other, unsuspected but most of polite society, was Camilla McCartney's wide acquaintance, her knowledge of the magic of the islanders that had been born and brought up on the island of St. Thomas. This subject had been virtually an obsession with her since childhood. Upon it she had centered her attention, concentrated her fine mind, and using every possible opportunity which her independent position and the enormous amount of material at hand afforded, had mastered it in theory and practice throughout its almost innumerable ramifications. There was first the obeah. This, deriving originally from the Ashanti slaves, had come into the West Indies through the gate of Jamaica. It was a combined system of magical formulas and the use of drugs. Through it, a skillful practitioner could obtain extraordinary results. It involved a very complete materia medica and a background settings for the usage and practice thereof, which reached back through uncounted centuries into rituals that were the very heart of primitive savagery. The much more greatly extended affair called voodoo, an extraordinarily complex fabric of black and white revelatory occultism, had made its way through the islands chiefly through the Haitian doorway from its proximate source, Dahomey, whence the early French colonists of Hispaniola had brought their original quotas of slaves. Voodoo, an infinitely broader and more stratified system than the medieval obeah, involved much that appeared to the average person mere superficial stupidness, but in its deeper and more basic aspects it included many very terrible things, which Camilla McCartney had encountered, succeeded in undertaking, and appropriated into this terrific fund of learning which was hers, as this fell subject took her through the dim backgrounds of its origins to the unspeakable snake worship of Africa's deadliest interior. The considerable population of the island, from the most fanatical Hogan, presiding in the high hills over the dire periodic rites of the baptism and the slaughter of goats and bullocks, and willingly offered human victims whose blood mingled with red rum made that unholy communion out of which grew the unnameable orgies of the deep interior heights, down to the lowliest children gathering fruits or stealing yams for the sustenance of their body. Every one of these was aware of this singular preoccupation, unacknowledged the supremacy of this lady, paid her reverence, feared her acknowledged powers, would as soon have lopped off a foot as to cross her lightest wish. Captain the Honorable William Macmillan made up his mind that her grasp of these matters was extraordinary. His questionings and Camilla's informative replies had barely touched upon the edge of what she knew. And the former captain, her cousin Saul McCartney, did not know that his heiress cousin cherished any interest except that which he had always demonstrated so plainly in his own direction. Going into breakfast, Saul McCartney was nearly knocked off his feet by the physical impact of his uncle's greeting. Camilla's father had been spending the morning overlooking a property of his east of the town in the direction of Smith Bay. He had thus missed meeting Saul at Le Coq d'Or, but had learned of his nephew's arrival on his way home. The town, indeed, was agog with it. So sustained was his enthusiasm, the more especially after imbibing his share of the unusually large provision of wine for midday meal which his daughter's desire to honor the occasion had provided. Then he monopolized most of his nephew's attention throughout breakfast and later in the drawing room after the conclusion of the meal. It was perhaps because of this joviality on his uncle's part that Saul McCartney failed to observe the totally new expression which had rested like a very small cloud on Camilla McCartney's face ever since a short time before going into the dining room. His uncle even insisted upon sending the prodigal home in the English barouche and this elegant equipage, with its sleek Danish coach horse and the liveried servants on its box, with cockades at the sides of their glistening silk toppers. He made the brief journey down one hill, a short distance through the town, and up another one to his father's house. Here, it being well after 2 o'clock in the afternoon and siesta hour, he found Fawcett, whom the old man had taken under his hospitable wing. The two had no private conversation together. Both were in high spirits, and these old McCartney fostered with his cordials, his French brandy, and a carafe of very ancient rum. The three men sat together over their liquor during the siesta hour, and during the session, old McCartney did most of the talking. He did not once refer to his son's capture by Brenner, the freebooter. He confined himself, in his desire to be entertaining, to his son's benefactor, Captain Fawcett, to a joyous succession of merry tales and ripe antique quips. Saul McCartney had therefore no reason to suspect, nor did it happen to occur to Fawcett to inform him that the latter's account of McCartney's adventures since the time he had last been heard from unto the present was in any wise different from the tale of shipwreck upon which they had agreed, and which McCartney had told out in full to his cousin Camilla. The three had not finished their jovial session before various strange matters affecting them very nearly, odd rumors, now being discussed avidly in various offices, residences, and gathering places about St. Thomas, were gathering headway, taking on various characteristic exaggerations, and indeed running like wildfire through the town. In a place like St. Thomas, crossroads and clearinghouse of the vast West Indian trade, which came and went through that port, and whose prosperity was dependent almost wholly upon shipping, even the town's riffraff was accustomed to think and express itself in terms of ships. It was an unimportant, loquacious youth who started the ball rolling. This fellow, a professional diver, came up to one of the wharves in his slab-sided, homemade rowboat, where he lounged aft, submitting to the propulsion of his younger brother, a scrawny lad of 12. This wharf rat had himself rowed out to the vessel from which the two notables he had observed had come ashore that morning. It was from the lips of this ne'er-do-well that various other wharf-side loiterers learned that the beautiful clipper vessel lying out there at anchor was provided with 8 carronade ports. Out of this idle curiosity, thus initially aroused, there proceeded various other harbor excursions in small boats. The young diver had somehow managed to miss the stanchion of the Long Tom which Fawcett, in an interval of prudence, had dismounted the night before. The fact that the Swallow carried such an armament, however, very soon trickled ashore. This nucleus of interesting information was soon followed up and almost eclipsed in interest by the various discussions and arguments which were soon running rife among the shipping interest of the town over the extraordinary numbers of the Swallow's crew. A round dozen, together with the usual pair of mates to supplement. The captain, as all these experts on ships were well aware, would ordinarily suffice for a vessel of this tonnage. Accounts and the terms of the various arguments varied between estimates ranging from 75 to 100 men on board the Swallow. A side issue within this category was also warmly discussed. Crews of vessels with home ports in the islands were commonly regular crews. This unprecedented gathering of men of such a large amount. Only 2 certain of the debaters held firmly that they had observed 3 others who might be officers aboard the Swallow, and one of these a gigantic man who wore nothing but an earring and a pair of faded dungaree trousers, was plainly the cook in charge of the Swallow's galley, and the other, or others, were his fellow assistants. But the town got its real fillip from the quite definite statement of a small fry worthy one James Pellman, who really gave them something to wrangle about when he came ashore after a visit of scrutiny, and stated flatly that this rakish, shining, black-hulled clipper was none other vessel than the McCartney's Hope, upon both hull and rigging of which he had worked steadily for 3 months in his own shipyard when the Hope was built during the winter of 1819. All these items of easily authenticated information bulked together and indicated to the comparatively unsophisticated as well as to the wiseacres only one possible conclusion. This was that the McCartney vessel, in command of which Captain Saul McCartney was known to have cleared from a South American port 3 months earlier, had as yet, in some unexplained fashion, been changed over into a free-trading ship, and that the harsh-featured sea dog in his fine clothes, who had accompanied Captain McCartney ashore that morning, could very well be none other than its commander. A certain lapse of time is ordinarily requisite for the loquacious stage of drunkenness to overtake the average hard-headed seafaring man. The crew of Fawcett's longboat, after 3 weeks' continuous duty at duty, had bestowed the boat safely, engaged the services of an elderly man to watch it in their absence, and drifted into the low rum shop nearest their landing place. And there, not long after their arrival, Fawcett's boatswain, a Dutch island bruiser, had been recognized by several former acquaintances as a sailorman who had gone out of the harbor of St. Eustatia in a small trading schooner which had disappeared off the face of the wide Caribbean 3 years previously. The rum-induced conversation of this gentleman, as the report of it went forth and flared through the town, corroborated as yet the tentative conclusion that a fully manned pirate ship lay for the time being at anchor in the peaceful harbor of St. Thomas, and that its master, whose identity as a certain Captain Fawcett had spread downward through the social strata from Le Coq d'Or itself, was here ashore, hobnobbing with the town's high gentry, and actually a guest of the McCartneys. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the town was seething with the news. There had been no such choice morsel to roll on the tongue since Henry Morgan had sacked the city of Panama. The first corroboration of that vague, distressing, but as yet unformed suspicion which had lodged itself in Camilla McCartney's mind came to her through Jen Sorensen, the butler. The grapevine route, so called, that curious door-to-door and mouth-to-ear method of communicating among the islanders of the community, is very rapid as well as very mysterious. Jens had heard this devastating story relayed up to him from the lowest riffraff of the town's waterfront, a matter of minutes after the name of their guest, seeping downward from Le Coq d'Or, had met, mingled with and crowned the damnatory group of successive details from the wharves. To anyone familiar with the effect of voodoo upon the mentality there would be nothing surprising in the fact that Jens proceeded straight to his mistress to whisper the story without any delay. For fear is the dominant note of the voodooist. The St. Thomas Islanders were actuated in their attitude towards Camilla McCartney by something infinitely deeper than the superficial respect which Captain Macmillan had noted. They feared her, and her proven powers, as they feared the dreaded demigod Damballa, tutelary manifestation of the unnamed guinea snake himself. For it was not as one who only inquires and studies that Camilla McCartney commanded awe and reverence of the St. Thomas Islanders. She had practiced this extraordinary art, and it was a result as something quite tangible, definite, and unmistakable which formed the background of that vast respect, and which had brought Jens cringing and trembling into her presence on this particular occasion. And Jens had not failed to include in his report the drunken sailorman's leering account of that captive lady's treatment by Saul McCartney, how an innocent young wife of Nevis had been outrageously forced into Saul's cabin, and when he had tired of her, how he had sent her back to the deck to go across the plank of death. What desolation penetrated deep and lodged itself there, and Camilla McCartney's soul can hardly be guessed at. From that moment she was convinced of the deep infamy of that entrancing lover-cousin of hers, whom she had adored with her whole heart since remoteness of her early childhood. But however poignantly indescribable, however extremely devastating may have been her private feelings, it is certain that she did not retire as a typical gentlewoman of the period would have done to eat out her heart in solitary desolation. Within 10 minutes, on the contrary, in response to her immediately issued orders, the English barouche, with its sleek Danish horses, its cockaded servants on the box, was carrying her down the hill, rapidly along through the town, and then the heavy coach horses were sweating up the other hill towards her uncle's house. If the seed of hatred, planted by Saul's duplicity, were already sprouting, nevertheless, she would warn him. She dreaded meeting him. Saul McCartney, summoned away from the somewhat drowsy end of that afternoon's convivial session with Fawcett and the old man, found his cousin awaiting him near the drawing-room door. She was standing, and her appearance was calm and collected. She addressed him directly, without preamble. "Saul, it is known in town, I came to warn you, it is running about the streets, that this Captain Fawcett of yours is the pirate. One of his men has been recognized. He has talked in one of the rum shops. They say that this ship is the Hope, altered into a different appearance. I advise you to go, Saul. Go at once, while it is safe." Saul McCartney turned his old disarming smile upon his cousin. He could feel the liquor he had drunk warming him, but his hard Irish head was reasonably clear. He was not befuddled. He stepped towards her as though, impulsively, his bronze face flushed from his recent potations, his arm extended and spread in a carefree gesture, as though he were about to take her in his embrace. "Camilla, Alana, you shouldn't have sat in your sweet face over the likes of me. I know well what I'm about, me darling, and as for Fawcett, well, as you're aware of his identity, you'll know he can care for himself. Very suitably indeed." He had advanced very close upon her now, but she stood unmoving, the serious expression of her face not change. She only held up a hand in a slight gesture against him, as though to warn him to pause and think. Again Saul McCartney stepped lightly toward his doom. "And may I not be having a kiss, Camilla?" His smiling face was unperturbed, his self-confidence unimpaired even now. Then fatally he added, "And now that you're here, Shulo, why should you not have me present my friend the captain? 'Twas he, you'll remember, that brought me back to ye. I would be fetching him within the moment." But Camilla merely looked at him with a level gaze. "I'm going now," she said, ignoring his suggestion and the crass insult to her gentility involved in it, and which beneath her calm exterior had outraged her and seared her very soul. The seed was growing apace. "I have warned you, Saul." She turned and walked out of the room and out of the house, then across the tiled gallery and down the black marble steps and out to her carriage. Saul McCartney hastened back to his father and Fawcett, despite his incurable bravado, motivated as always by his deep-seated selfishness. He had simply accepted the warning just given him at its face value. He addressed his drowsing father after a swift, meaningful glance at Fawcett. "We shall be needing the carriage, sir, if so be it's agreeable to you. We must be getting back on board, it appears, and I'll be hoping to look in on you again in the morning, sir." And without waiting for any permission, and ignoring his father's liquor-muffled protest against this abrupt departure, Saul McCartney rang the bell, ordered the family carriage to be waiting in the shortest possible time, and pressed a $6 into the butler's hand as an incentive to hasten the process. Within a quarter of an hour, after hasty farewells to the tearful and now befuddled old man, these two precious scoundrels were well on their way through the town toward the jetty where they had landed, and where upon arrival they collected their boat's crew out of the rum shop with vigorous revilings and not a few hearty clouts, and were shortly speeding across the turquoise and indigo waters of St. Thomas Harbor toward an anchored Swallow. Inside half an hour from their going up over her side and the hoisting of the longboat, the Swallow, without reference to the harbor master, clearance, or any other formality, was picking her lordly way daintily out past Colwell's battery at the harbor mouth, and was soon lost to the sight of all curious watchers in the welcoming swell of the Caribbean. This extraordinary visit of the supposedly long-drowned Captain McCartney to his native town, and the circumstances accompanying it, was a 9 days' wonder in St. Thomas. The widespread discussion it provoked died down after a while, it being supplanted in current interest by the many occurrences in so busy a port of call. It was not, of course, forgotten, although it dropped out of mind as a subject for acute debate.
Such opinion as remained after the arguments had been abandoned was divided opinion. Could the vessel possibly have been the Macartney's hope? Was this Captain Fawcett the pirate? Had Captain Saul Macartney thrown in his lot with free traders, or was such a course unthinkable on his part? The yarn which Captain Fawcett had spun in Le Coq d'Or seemed the reasonable explanation, if it were true. In the face of the fact that no other encounter explanation had been definitely put forward by anybody, this version was tacitly accepted by St. Thomas Society, but with a proviso, very generally made and very widely held, that this fellow must have been the Captain Fawcett after all. Saul Macartney had either been fooled by him, or else Saul's natural gratitude had served to cover, in his estimation of the fellow, any observed shortcomings on the part of this rescuer and friend in need. Camilla Macartney made no allusion whatever, even within the family circle, to the story Saul had told her. She was not, of course, called upon to express any opinion outside. She was quite well aware that both versions were falsehoods. She faced bravely, though with a sorely empty and broken heart, all her manifold social obligations in the town. Indeed, somewhat to distract her tortured mind, wherein that seed of hate was by now growing into a lusty plant, the heiress of the Macartney fortune engaged herself rather more fully than usual that summer season in the various current activities. She forced herself to greater preoccupation than ever in her attention to her occult pursuits. She even took up afresh the oil painting, long ago abandoned by her, which had been one of her early accomplishments. It was during this period, a very dreadful one for her, succeeding as it did abruptly upon her momentary happiness at her cousin Saul's restoration to the land of the living, which had dissipated her acute and sustained grief over its presumptive loss at sea, and the hope that she undertook, with what obscure premonitory motive derived from curious skill in the strange and terrible arts of the people of the island, can only be darkly surmised, another and very definite task. This was the painting of a panoramic view of the town, as seen from the harbor. At this she toiled day after day, from the awning afterdeck of one of the smaller Macartney packet vessels. This boat had been anchored to serve her purpose at the point of vantage she had selected. She worked at her panorama in the clear, pure light of many early summer mornings. Before her, on the rather large canvas she had chosen for this purpose, there gradually grew into objectivity the wharves, the public buildings, the fort, the 3 hills with their red-roofed mansions set amid decorative trees. Her almost incredible industry was, really, a symptom of the strange obsession now beginning to invade her reason. Camilla Macartney had suffered a definite mental lesion. The scrupulous courtesy of the St. Thomians, that graceful mantle of manners which had never been allowed to wear thin, was unobtrusively interposed between the respected Macartneys and the dreadful scandal which had reached out and touched their impeccable family garment of respectability. By no word spoken, by no overt act, by not so much as a breath were they reminded of Captain Macartney's recent visit ashore or his hasty and irregular departure. Captain Macmillan, therefore, as a guest of Camilla's father, heard nothing of it. He sensed, however, a certain indefinite undercurrent of family trouble, and yielding to this sure instinct, ended his visit with all the niceties of high breeding, and departed from Santa Cruz. Just before he left, on the morning after the farewell dinner, which had been given as a final gesture in his honor, the captain managed to convey to Camilla the measure of his appreciation. He placed, as it were, his sword at her disposal. It was very nicely made, that gesture of gallantry. It was not to be mistaken for the preliminary to a possible later offer of marriage. It was anything but braggadocio. It was somehow entirely appropriate to the situation. The handsome, upstanding captain left with his hostess precisely the impression he intended. That is, he left her the feeling that there was an adequate person to depend upon in a pinch, and that she had been invited to depend upon him should the pinch come. A third of the way up one of the mountains northward, and behind the 3 gentle hills on the southern slopes of which the ancient city of St. Thomas is built, there stood, and still stands, a small stone gentry residence, originally built in the middle of the 18th century by an exiled French family which had taken refuge in this kindly Danish colony and played at raising vanilla up there on their airy little estate overlooking the town and sea. This place was still known by its original name of Ma Folie, a title early bestowed upon it by Madame la Marquise, who had looked upon it through a window in her temporary apartment in the Hotel du Commerce in the town, while the roofing was being placed upon her new house, there and then assuring herself that only perched upon the back of one of those diminutive burrows which cluttered up the town streets could anyone like herself possibly manage the ascent to such a site. Ma Folie was now one of the many McCartney properties. It belonged to Camilla, having come to her as a portion of her maternal inheritance, and upon it she re-established the vanilla planting, helped out by several freshly cleared acres and cocoa. No donkey was required nowadays to convey a lady up the tortuous, steep little trail from the town of Ma Folie. A carriage road led past its unpretentious square entrance post of whitewashed cemented stone, and when Camilla McCartney visited her hillside estate, the English barouche carried her there, the long climb causing the heavy coach horses to sweat mightily and helping, as the coachman said, to keep them in condition. It was up here that she had long ago established what might be called her laboratory. It was at Ma Folie, her village housed only servants selected by herself as her tenant laborers, that she had in the course of years brought the practice of the strange art to its perfection. She had for some time now confined her practice to meeting what might be called charitable demands upon her. Talismans to protect, amulets to attract or repel, potent wangas, only such modest products of the fine art of voodoo as these went out from that occult workshop of hers at Ma Folie, went out into the eager outstretched hands of the afflicted, whose manifold plights had engaged Camilla McCartney's sympathy, to the relief of those abject ones who called upon her, in fear and trembling, as their last resort against who knows what obscure devilish attacks, what outrageous charmings, wrought by the inimical ruthlessness of one to another. No vanilla pot, no single cocoa bean had been stolen from Ma Folie estate since Camilla McCartney had planted it afresh 9 years before. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning of a day near the middle of August that a kind of tremor of emotion ran through the town of St. Thomas, a matter of minutes after a report of the official watcher and the many other persons in the town and along the wharves who sustained interest in shipping matters caused their eyes to turn over and anon toward the wide harbor mouth. The Swallow, which 3 months before had literally run away, ignoring all the niceties of a ship's departure from any port, and even the official leave-taking, was coming in brazenly, lilting daintily along under the stiff trade, her decks visibly swarming with the many members of her efficient and numerous crew. She came up into the wind like a little man-o'-war, jauntily, her sails coming down simultaneously with a precision to warm the hearts of those ship-wise watchers, her rigging slatting with reports like musket shots, the furling and stowing of canvas, a truly marvelous demonstration of the efficiency which now reigned aft. These details of rapid-fire seamanship, swiftly as they were being handled, were as yet incomplete when the longboat went straight down from its davits into the water, and Saul McCartney followed his boat's crew over the side and picked up his tiller ropes. The Swallow's anchorage this time was closer in, and it seemed no time at all to the thronging, gaping watchers on the jetty before he sprang ashore and was up the steps. There was no rum shop for the boat crew this time. Without their officers even looking back at them over their shoulder, the oarsmen pushed off, turned about, and rowed back to the Swallow. Saul McCartney was, if possible, even more debonair than ever. His self-confident smile adorned his even more heavily bronzed face. He was hatless as usual, and his handsome figure was mightily set off by a gaily sprigged waistcoat and a ruffled shirt of fine cambric, which showed between the silver-braided lapels of the maroon-colored coat of French cloth with a deep velvet collar, the pantaloons of which, matching the coat's cloth, were strapped under a pair of low boots of very shining black leather. The throng on the jetty was plainly in a different mood as compared to the vociferous welcoming mob of 3 months before. They stayed close together in a little phalanx this time, and from them came fewer welcoming smiles. Plainly sensing this, Saul McCartney bestowed on his riffraff of the wharves no more than a passing glance of smiling raillery. He passed them and entered the town with rapid, purposeful strides as though intent on some very definite business, and utterly ignoring the hum of released though muted conversation which rose behind him as though from an aroused swarm of bees, entered the main thoroughfare, turned sharply to his left along it, proceeded in this direction some 40 feet, and turned into the small office of one Axel Peterson, a purveyor of ship stores. Blond, stout, genial Axel Peterson stared from his broad, comfortable desk at this entrance and allowed his lower jaw to sag. Then he rose uncertainly to his feet, and his 4 neatly garbed clerks rose from their 4 respective high stools with him, and in precise conformity with their employee's facial reaction, their 4 pairs of mottled iris eyes rounded out altogether like saucers, and their 4 lower jaws sagged in unison. Saul McCartney threw back his head and laughed aloud. Then addressing Peterson, Axel, I wouldn't have thought it of ye. 'Tis but stores I'm after, man. Vast stores, the likes of which you might be selling in the course of a week to 5 vessels, if so be ye had the fortune to get that many all in 1 week. Then, a shade more seriously, 'tis pork I want, beans, coffee in sacks, limes by the gunny sack, 101 things, all of them written down to save you trouble, ye great feckless porker. And here, beside the list which I'm handing you now, is the reassurance. And Saul McCartney, thrusting his list of ship supplies, neatly printed on a long slip of paper under the nose of the stultified Peterson, slapped down upon the desktop beside it the bulging purse which he had hauled out of the tail pocket of his beautiful maroon-colored French coat. There's 250 English sovereigns there fornest ye, Axel. You can have it counted out, or do it yourself, and if that does not suffice to cover the list, why, there's another shot in this locker behind ye, you fat robber of pettifoggy ship stewards. And before the protruding, bemused blue eyes of portly Axel Peterson, Saul McCartney shook banteringly a thick sheaf of Bank of England 10-pound notes. By the time he had returned these to the same capacious pocket, he was at the door, had paused, turned, and leaning for an instant nonchalantly against the door jamb, remarked, You're to have the stores piled up on your wharf not an instant later than 2 o'clock this day. Then the bantering smile again to the fore, and shaking a long, shapely forefinger towards the goggling dealer in ship stores, he added, You'll observe, Axel, I'm not taking your store by force and arms. I'm not sacking this town, this time. Then Saul McCartney was gone, and Axel Peterson, muttering unintelligibly as he assembled his scattered wits and those of his 4 clerks, the heavy purse clutched tightly by its middle in one pudgy hand, and the long list of the Swallow's required stores held a little unsteadily before his nearsighted blue eyes, methodically began the process of getting this enormous order assembled. It was with a perfectly calm exterior that Camilla McCartney received her cousin Saul a quarter of an hour later. The turmoil beneath this prideful reserve might, perhaps, be guessed at, but as the art of guessing had never formed any part of Saul McCartney's mental equipment, he made no effort in that direction. He began at once with his usual self-confident directness upon what he had come to say. Camilla, I've come to ye in haste, 'tis true, and I'm asking your indulgence for that. 'Twas gracious of ye, as always, to be here at home when I chanced to arrive. I'll go straight to the point, if so be ye have no objections to make, and say in plain words what I know well to have been in the hearts of the 2 of us this many a year. I'm asking you now, Camilla. I'm begging you with my whole soul to say that you'll ride down with me now, Camilla, to the English church, and the 2 of us be married, and then sail with me for the truly magnificent home I've been establishing for ye over in Andros. Camilla McCartney continued to sit outwardly unmoved, where she had received him when Jens had shown him into the drawing-room. She had not been looking at her cousin during this characteristically confident and even impulsive declaration of his. Her eyes were upon her hands, which lay clasped tightly in her lap, and she did not raise them to reply. She did not, however, keep him waiting. She said in a perfectly level voice in which there was apparently no single trace or indication of the tearing internal emotion which surged through her outraged heart at this last and unforgivable insult. "I shall not become your wife, Saul, now or ever." Then, as he stood before her, his buoyant self-confidence for once checked, his face suddenly configured into something like the momentary grotesqueness of Axel Peterson's, she added, in that same level tone, which had about it now, however, the small suggestion of rising inflection, "Do not come to me again. Go now. At once." This final interview with her cousin Saul was unquestionably the element which served to crystallize into an active and sustained hatred the successive emotional crisis and their consequent abnormal states of mind which the events here recorded had stirred up within this woman so terribly equipped for vengeance. The seed of hatred was now a full-grown plant. Upon a woman of Camilla McCartney's depth and emotional capacity, the felonious behavior of Saul McCartney had had a very terrible and a very deep-reaching mental effect. She had adored and worshipped him for as long as she could remember. He had torn down and riven apart and left lying about her in brutally shattered fragments the whole structure of her life. He had smashed the solid pride of her family into shreds. He had disgraced himself blatantly, deliberately, with a ruthless abandon. He had piled insult to her upon insult. He had taken her pure love for him, crushed and defiled it. And now these irresistible blows had had the terrible effect of breaking down the serene composure of this gentlewoman. All her love for her cousin and all her pride in him were transformed into one definite, flaming, and consuming purpose. She must wipe out those dreadful stains. Arrived in the empty library, Camilla McCartney went straight to the great rosewood desk and without any delay wrote a letter. The footman who hurried with this missive down the hill actually passed Saul McCartney, likewise descending it. Within a very short time after its reception, the captain of the little packet vessel, upon which anchored quite close to shore, Camilla McCartney had been painting her nearly finished panorama of the town, had gone ashore to round out his full crew. The packet itself, with Camilla McCartney on board, sailed out of St. Thomas Harbor that afternoon in plain sight of the restocked Swallow, whose great spread of gleaming white canvas showed gloriously under the afternoon sun as she laid her course due southwest. The packet, lying hers to the southward, rolled and tossed at a steady 8-knot clip under the spanking trade straight for the island of Santa Cruz. Captain the Honorable William McMillan was summoned from his 7 o'clock dinner in his estate house up in the gentle hills of the island's north side, and only his phlegmatic Scottish temperament, working together with his aristocratic self-control, prevented his shapely jaw from sagging and his blue eyes from becoming saucer-like when they had recorded for him the identity of this wholly unexpected visitor. Camilla McCartney wasted none of the captain's time, nor was her arrival cause for any cooling of the excellent repast from which he had arisen to receive her. "I have not," said she downrightly in response to the astounded captain's initial inquiry as to whether she had dined. "And," she added, "I should be glad to sit down with you at once, if that meets your convenience, sir. It is, as you may very well have surmised, a very deep and pressing matter upon which I have ventured to come to you. That, I should imagine, would best be discussed while we sit at table, and so without delay." Again, the captain demonstrated his admirable manners. He merely bowed and led the way to the door of his dining room. Once seated opposite Captain McMillan, Camilla McCartney again went straight to her point. The captain quite definitely forgot to eat in the amazing and immediate interest of what she proceeded to say. "I am offering the reward of 1,000 English sovereigns for the apprehension at sea and the bringing to St. Thomas for their trials of the free trader Fawcett and his mates. It may very well be no secret to you, sir, that a member of our family is one of these men. I think that any comment between us upon that subject will be superfluity. You will take note, if you please, that it is I, a member of our family, who offer the reward I have named for his apprehension. You will understand everything that is involved. Earlier this day, it was proposed to me that I should sail upon a ship without very much notice. I have come here to you, sir, on one of my father's vessels. Captain Stewart, her commander, a trusted man in our employ, has accompanied me all the way to your door. He is here now, waiting in the third calash, which I secured in Frederickstead for the drive here to your house. Perhaps you'll be good enough to have some food taken to him. I have come, Captain Macmillan, in all this haste, actually to request you to do the same thing that I mentioned. You made me see, when you were our guest, that I could wholly rely on you, sir. I'm here to ask you, as a military man, to command the expedition which I'm sending out. I'm asking you to sail back with Captain Stewart and me for St. Thomas tonight. Captain Macmillan looked at Camilla McCartney across the length of his glistening mahogany dining table. He had been listening very carefully to her speech. He rang his table bell now that he was sure she was finished, and when his serving man answered the summons, ordered him to prepare a repast for the waiting ship's captain, and to send in to him his groom. Then, with a bow to his guest, and pushing back his chair and rising, he said, "You will excuse me, Miss McCartney, I trust, for the little time I shall require to pack. It will not occupy me very long." 4. The story of how the Hyperion, newest and swiftest of all the McCartney vessels, was outfitted and armed for the pursuit and capture of Captain Fawcett is a little epic in itself. It would include, among the many details extant, to the intensive search among the shipping resources of St. Thomas for the swivel gun, which 2 days after Captain Macmillan's arrival on the scene was being securely bolted through the oak timbers of the Hyperion's afterdeck. A surprisingly complete record of this extraordinary piece of activity survives among the ancient colonial archives. Perhaps the recording clerk of the period in his government house office was, like everyone else in St. Thomas, fascinated by the ruthless swiftness with which that job, under the impact of Camilla McCartney's eye, was pushed through to a successful conclusion in precisely 48 hours. Nothing like this rate of speed had ever been heard of even in St. Thomas. The many men engaged in this Herculean task at Pellman's shipyard worked day and night continuously in 3 8-hour shifts. It is significant that these shipwrights and other skilled courtesans were all islanders. They had assembled in their scores and dozens from every quarter of the widespread town, irrespective of age or exactions of their current employments. From the instant that the grapevine routes spread through the population of the town, the summons to this task, which Camilla McCartney had quietly uttered in the ear of her butler, Jan Sorensen. The Hyperion, under the command of her own officers, but with the understanding that Captain Macmillan was in sole charge of the expedition, came up with the Swallow, a little under 4 days from the hour of her sailing out of St. Thomas Harbor. Captain Macmillan caught Fawcett at a vast disadvantage. The Swallow, very lightly manned at the moment, hung in her stays, her riding sails flapping with reports like pistol shots as her graceful head was held into the wind. She lay some 10 ship lengths way to the leeward of an American merchant ship vessel about which the Swallow's boats, now 9 in number, were grouped, a single member of the crew in each. Fawcett and his 2 lieutenants and 9/10 of his crew cutthroats were ransacking their prize, whose officers, crew, and passengers had been disposed of under nailed hatches. They appeared indeed to be so thoroughly occupied in this nefarious work as to have ignored entirely any preparations for meeting the Hyperion's attack, a circumstance sufficiently strange to have impressed Captain Macmillan profoundly. The Hyperion's officers, unable to account for this singular quiescence on the part of the pirates, attributed it to their probably failing to suspect that the Hyperion was anything but another trading vessel, which had happened to blunder along on her course into this proximity. With a strange, quick gripping at the heart, quite new in his experience, Captain Macmillan permitted himself to suspect, though for a brief instant only, that something of the strange power which he had glimpsed in his contacts with Camilla McCartney might in some extraordinary fashion be somehow responsible for this phenomenon. But this thought, as too utterly ridiculous for harborage In normal man's mind, he put away from him instanter. The tragedy of the situation appeared to be simple, and Captain Macmillan ordered a dozen men in charge of the Hyperion's second mate over the side in the largest of the boats. The maneuver of dropping an already manned boat from the davits, a risky undertaking in any event, was handled successfully, and exceptionally quiet sea contributing to the management of this piece of seamanship. This boat's crew, all armed with pistols and cutlasses which had been hastily served out to them, had no difficulty whatever in getting over the Swallow's side and making themselves masters of the pirate vessel. The dozen sailors had butchered the 7 members of the pirate crew left on board the Swallow within 40 seconds of their landing upon her deck, and Mr. Matthews, the officer in charge of them, hauled down with his own hands the Jolly Roger, which, true to the free-trading traditions of the Main, flaunted at the Swallow's main peak. The magnificent cooperation of the 15 sailors constituting the Hyperion's deck crew made possible the next daring piece of seamanship which the Hyperion's captain had agreed to attempt. This was Captain Macmillan's plan. The Hyperion should lay alongside the American vessel, grapple to her and board, with all hands from deck to deck. This idea, almost unheard of in its modern sea warfare, has suggested itself as practicable in this instance to Captain Macmillan. From his reading, such had been the tactics of the antique Mediterranean galleys. For the purpose of retaining the outward appearance of a simple trader, Captain Macmillan had concealed the 33 additional members of his heavily armed crew, and these had not been brought on deck until he was almost ready to have the grapples thrown. These reserves now swarmed upon the Hyperion's deck in the midst of bedlam of shouts, yells, and curses, punctuated by pistol shots from the pirate crew on board their prize. These were taken at a vast disadvantage. Their prize vessel was immobile. They had, for what had appeared to Captain Macmillan, some inexplicable reason, apparently failed until the very last moment to realize the Hyperion's intentions. Most of them were busily engaged in looting their prize. Under this process, 5 of the Swallow's 9 boats had already been laden gunwale deep with the miscellaneous plunder already taken out of the American ship. 2 of these laden small boats and 2 others of the Swallow's 9 were crushed like eggshells as the Hyperion closed in and threw her grappling hooks. Then, in a silence new and strange in Captain Macmillan's previous experience in hand-to-hand fighting, his 48 fighting men followed him over the rails and fell upon the pirates. Within 3 minutes, the American vessel's deck was a shambles. Camilla McCartney's myrmidons, like militant fiends from some strange hell of their own, their eyeballs rolling, their white teeth flashing as they bared their lips in the ecstasy of this mission of wholesale slaughter, spread irresistibly with grunts and low mutterings and strange cries about the deck. Not a member of the pirate crew escaped their ruthless onslaught. Hard skulls were split asunder and lopped arms strewed the deck, though bodies were transfixed and the gasping wounded men were trampled lifeless in the terrible energy of these fighting men. Then abruptly, save for a harsh sobbing sound from laboring, panting lungs, after their terrific exertion, a strange silence fell, and toward Captain Macmillan, who stood well-nigh aghast over the utter strangeness of this unprecedented carnage, which had just taken place under his eyes and under his command, there came a huge, smiling man, his feet scarlet, as he slouched along that moist and slippery deck, a crimson cutlass dangling loosely from the red hand at the end of a red arm. This one, addressing the captain in a low, humble, and deprecating voice, said, "Come now, please. Come, please, sir. See the gentleman. You tell us if he should stay alive." And Captain Macmillan, bemused, followed this guide along the deck, flushed and scarlet, with the lifeblood of those pulped heads which had been Captain Fawcett's pirate crew, stepped aft to where behind the main deck house 3 trussed and helpless white men lay upon a cleaner section of that vessel's deck, under the baleful eye of another strapping man with red feet and a naked red cutlass brandished in a red hand. The Swallow, her own somewhat blood-soiled deck, now shining spotless under the mighty holy stonings it had received at the hands of its prize crew of 12, under the command of the Hyperion's second mate, the Danish flag now flying gaily from her masthead, followed the Hyperion into St. Thomas, harbor on the 2nd day of September 1825. The 2 vessels came up to their designated anchorages smartly, and shortly thereafter, and for the last time, saw Macartney, accompanied by his crony, Captain Fawcett, and his colleague, the other pirate mate, was rowed ashore in the familiar longboat. But during this short and rapid trip, these 3 gentlemen did not for once occupy the stern sheets. They sat forward, their hands and feet in the irons, the 6 oarsmen between them and Mr. Matthews, the Hyperion's mate, who held the tiller rope, and Captain the Honorable William Macmillan, who sat erect beside him. 5. I have already recorded my first horrified reaction to the appearance of the handsome, black-haired piratical mate whose painted arm my innocent thumbtack had penetrated. My next reaction, rather curiously, was a pressing, insistent, sudden impulse to withdraw the tack. I did so forthwith, with trembling fingers, I here openly confess. My third and final reaction, which came to me not long afterward, and when I had somewhat succeeded in pulling myself together, was once more to get out my magnifying glass and take another good look through it. After all, I told myself, I was here confronted with nothing more in the way of material facts than a large-sized, somewhat crudely done, and very old oil painting. I got the glass and reassured myself the blood was, of course, as now critically examined, magnified by 16 diameters, merely a few splattered drops of the very same vermilion pigment which my somewhat clever amateur artist had used for the red roofs of the houses, the foulards of the islanders, and those many glorious flaming flower blossoms. Quite obviously, these particular spatters of red had not been in the liquid state for more than a century. Having ascertained these facts beyond the shadow of any lingering doubts in the field of everyday material fact, my one remaining bit of surviving wonderment settled itself about the minor puzzle of just why I had failed to observe these spots of ancient, dry, and brittle paint during the long and careful scrutiny to which I had subjected the picture the evening before. A curious coincidence this, that the tiny red spots should happen to be precisely in the place where blood would be flowing if it had flowed from my tack wound and that dangled painted arm. I looked next, curiously, through my glass at the fellow's face. I could perceive now none of that acutely agonized expression which had accentuated my first startled horror at the sight of the blood. And so, pretty well assured, I went back to my bedroom and finished dressing. And thereafter, as the course of affairs proceeded, I could not get the thing out of my mind. I will pass over any attempt at describing the psychological processes involved, and say here merely that by the end of a couple of weeks or so, I was in that state of obsession which made it impossible for me to do my regular work, or indeed to think of anything else, and then, chiefly to relieve my mind of this vastly annoying preoccupation, I began upon that course of investigatory research to which I had already alluded. When I had finished this, had gone down to the end of the last bypath which it involved, it was well on in the year 1930. It had taken 3 years, and it was worth it. I was in St. Thomas that season, and St. Thomas was still operating under the regime which had prevailed since the spring of 1917, at which time the United States had purchased the old Danish West Indies from Denmark as a war treasure during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. In 1930, our naval forces had not yet withdrawn from our Virgin Island colony. The administration was still actively under the direction of His Excellency Captain Waldo Evans, United States Navy retired, and the heads of the major departments were still the efficient and personable gentlemen assigned to those duties by the Secretary of the Navy. My intimate friend, Dr. Pellicer, the pride of the U.S.N. Medical Corps, was still in active charge of the Naval Hospital, and I could rely upon Dr. Pellicer, whose interest in and knowledge of the strange and ultra beliefs, customs, and practices of numerous strange corners of this partly civilized world of ours were both deep and, as it seemed to me, virtually exhaustive. To this good friend of mine, this walking encyclopedia of strange knowledge, I took naturally my findings in this very strange and utterly fascinating story of old St. Thomas. We spent several long evenings together over it. When I had imparted all the facts, while my surgeon friend listened, as is his custom, for hours on end without a single interruption, we proceeded to spend many more evenings discussing it, sometimes at the hospitable doctor's bachelor dinner table, and afterward far into those tropic nights of spice and balm, and sometimes at my house, which is quite near the old T.L. McCartney mansion on Denmark Hill. In the course of these many evenings, I added to the account of the affair, which had emerged out of my long investigation, two additional phases of this matter, which I have not included in my account as written out here because, in the form in which these took my mind, they were almost totally conjectural. Of these, the first took a point of departure from the depiction of the rope, as shown in the painting with which Saul McCartney had been hanged. I have mentioned the painstaking particularity with which the artist had put in the minor details of the composition. I have illustrated this by stating that the 7 traditional turns of the hangman's knot were to be seen showing plainly under Captain Fawcett's left ear. The same type of knot, I may add here, was also painted laboriously upon the noose which had done to death Fawcett's other mate. But Saul McCartney's rope did not show such a knot. In fact, it showed virtually no knot at all. Even under the magnifying glass, a knot expert would have been unable to name in any category of knots the inconspicuous slight enlargement at the place where Saul McCartney's noose was joined. Another point about this rope which might or might not have any significance was the fact that it was of a color slightly but yet distinctly different from the hemp color of the other two. Saul McCartney's rope was of a faint greenish blue color. Upon this rather slight basis for conjecture, I hazarded the following enlargement: that Camilla McCartney, just after the verdict of the Danish Colonial High Court had become known to her, and I ventured to express the belief that she had known it before any other white person, said in a quiet voice to her butler, Jean Sorensen, "I'm going to Ma Folie. Tonight at 9 o'clock precisely, Ajax Mendoza is to come to me there. And this is merely my imaginative supplement. It will be remembered based on my own knowledge of the dark ways of voodoo. Burly Ajax Mendoza, capital executioner and the honorable employee of the Danish colonial administration, whose father, Jupiter Mendoza, had held that office before him, and whose grandfather, Achilles Mendoza, whose most notable performance had been the racking of the exsurrectionist leader Tancred, who had been brought back to the capital in chains after the perpetration of his many atrocities in the St. John uprising in 1733, had been the first of the line. That Ajax Mendoza, not fierce and truculent as he looked standing there beside the police master on Captain Fawcett's gallows platform, but trembling and cringing, had kept the appointment to which he had been summoned. Having received his orders, he had then hastened to bring to Camilla McCartney the particular length of thin manila rope, which was later to be strung from the arm of Saul McCartney's gallows, and had left it with her until she returned it to him before the hour of the execution, and that he had received it back and reeved it through its pulley, with even more fear and trembling and cringings at being obliged to handle this transmuted thing, whose very color was a terror and a distress to him, now that it had passed through that fearsome laboratory of white missy who knew the snake. And my second conjectural hypothesis I based upon the fact which my research had revealed to me, that all the members of the honorable clan of McCartney resident in St. Thomas had, with obvious propriety, kept to their closely shuttered several residences during the entire day of that public execution. That is, all of the McCartneys except the heiress of the McCartney fortune, Camilla. Half an hour before high noon on that public holiday, the English barouche had deposited Camilla McCartney at one of the wharves a little away from the center of the town, where that great throng had gathered to see the pirates hanged, and from there she had been rowed out to the small vessel, which had that morning gone back to its old anchorage near the shore. There, in her old place under the awning of the afterdeck, she had very calmly and deliberately set up her easel, and placed before her the all but finished panorama upon which she had been working, and had thereupon begun to paint, and so had continued quietly painting until the 3 bodies of those pirates, which had been left dangling for the space of a whole hour, according to the sentence, as a salutary example, and had then ended her work and gone back to the wharf, carrying carefully the now finished panorama to where the English barouche awaited her. By conjecture, on the basis of these facts, I managed somehow to convey to Dr. Pellicer, a man whose mind is attuned to such matters, the tentative, uncertain idea, I should not dare to name it a conviction, that Camilla McCartney, by some application of that uncanny skill of hers in the arts of darkness, had, as it were, caught the life principle of her cousin, Saul McCartney, as it escaped from his splendid body there at the end of that slightly discolored and curious knotted rope, and fastened it down upon her canvas within the simulacrum of that little painted figure through the arm of which I had thrust a thumbtack. These 2 queer ideas of mine, which had been knocking about inside my head, strangely enough did not provoke the retort, outrageous, from Dr. Pellicer, a man of the highest scientific attainments. I had hesitated to put such thoughts into words, and I confess that I was surprised that his response in the form of a series of nods of the head did not seem to indicate the indulgence of a normal mind towards the drivellings of some imbecile. Dr. Pellicer deferred any verbal reply to this imaginative climax of mind, placed as it was at the very end of our discussion, when he did shift his mighty bulk where I reclined in my Chinese rattan lounge chair on my airy west gallery. A sure preliminary to any remarks from him, his first words surprised me a little. Is there any doubt, Canvan, in your mind about the identity of this painted portrait figure of the mate with Saul McCartney himself? No, said I. I was able to secure 2 faded old ambrotypes of Saul McCartney. At least I was given a good look at them. There can, I think, be no question on that score. For the space of several minutes, Pellicer remained silent. Then he slightly shifted his leonine head to look at me. Canavan, said he, people like you and me, who have seen this kind of thing working under our very eyes, all around us, among people like these West Indian villagers, well, we know. Then, more animatedly, and sitting up a little in his chair, the doctor said, on that basis, Canavan, on the pragmatic basis, if you will, and that, God knows, is scientific, based on observation, the only thing that we can do is to give this queer, devilish thing the benefit of the doubt. Our doubt, to say nothing of what the general public would think of such ideas. Should you say that there is anything that can be done about it? I inquired. I have the picture, you know, and you have heard the facts as they have come under my observation. Is there any, what shall I say, any responsibility involved on the basis of those facts and any conjectural additions that you and I may choose to make? That, said Pellicer, is what I meant by the benefit of the doubt. Thinking about this for the moment in terms of the limitations, the incompleteness of human knowledge, and the short distance we have managed to travel along the road of civilization, I should say that there is a responsibility. What shall I do, if anything? Said I, a little taken aback at his downrightness. Again, Dr. Pellicer looked at me for a long moment and nodded his head several times. Then, burn the thing, Canavan. Fire the solvent. Do you comprehend me? Have I said enough? I thought over this through the space of several silent minutes. Then, a trifle hesitantly, because I was not at all sure that I had grasped the implications which lay below this very simple suggestion. You mean that if there's anything in it, Canavan, that benefit of the doubt again, you see, if to put such an outrageous hypothesis in the same phrase, the life, the soul, the personality remains unreleased, and that because of Camilla McCartney's use of a pragmatic magical skill, such as is operative today over there in the hills of Haiti, to name only the focus of this particular cultus, well then, This time it was I who nodded, slowly several times. After that, I sat quietly in my chair for long minutes in the little silence which lay between us. We had said, it seemed to me, everything that was to be said. We had gone as far as human limitations permitted in the long investigation of this strange affair. Then I summoned my houseman, Stephen Penn. "Stephen," said I, "go and find out if the charcoal pots in the kitchen have burned out since breakfast. I imagine that about this time there should be a little charcoal left to burn out in each of them. If so, put all the charcoal into one pot and bring it out here on the gallery. If not, fix me a new charcoal fire in the largest pot. Fill it about half full." "Yes, sir," said Stephen, and departed on his errand. Within 3 minutes, the excellent Stephen was back. He sat down on the tile floor beside my chair, the largest of my 4 kitchen charcoal pots. It was half full of brightly glowing embers. I sent them away before I went into the house to fetch the painting. It was a curious fact that this faithful suitor of mine, a native of St. Thomas, had manifested an increasing aversion to anything like contact with or even sight of the old picture, an aversion dating from that afternoon when he had discovered it 3 years before in the lumber room of my Santa Crucian hired residence. Then I brought it out and laid it flat, after clearing a place for it, on the large plain table which stands against the wall of the house on my gallery. Pellicer came over and stood beside me, and in silence we looked long and searchingly at Camilla McCartney's panorama for the last time. Then, with a sharp, small blade of my pocket knife, I cut it cleanly through again and again until it was in 7 or 8 strips. A little of the old brittle paint cracked and flaked off in this process. Having piled the strips one on top of another, I picked up the topmost of the 3 or 4 spread newspapers, which I had placed under the canvas to save the tabletop from my knife point, and these flakes and chips I poured first off into the newspaper's edge upon the glowing embers. These bits of dry ancient pigment hissed, flared up, and then quickly melted away. Then I burned the strips very carefully until all but one were consumed. This perhaps because of some latent dramatic instinct whose existence until that moment I had never really suspected was the one containing the figure of Saul McCartney. I paused, the strip in my hand, and looked at Pellicer. His face was inscrutable. He nodded his head at me, however, as though to encourage me to proceed and finish my task. With perhaps a trifle of extra care, I inserted the end of this last strip into the charcoal pot. It caught fire and began to burn, through precisely as its predecessors had caught and burned, and finally disintegrated into a light grayish ash. Then a very strange thing happened. There was no slightest breath of air moving in that sheltered corner of the gallery. The entire solid bulk of the house sheltered it from the steady northeast trade, now at 3 in the afternoon, at its slowest daily ebb, a mere wavering, tenuous pulsing. And yet, at the precise instant when the solid material of that last strip had been transmuted by the power of the fire into the whitish wavering ghost of material objects which we name ash, from the very center of the still brightly glowing charcoal embers there rose a thin, delicate wisp of greenish-blue smoke, which spiraled before our eyes under the impact of some obscure pulsation in the quiet air about us, then stiffened, as yet unbroken, into a taut vertical line, the upper end of which abruptly turned, curving down upon itself, completing the representation of the hangman's noose. And then, instantly this contour wavered and broke, and ceased to be, and all that remained there before fascinated eyes was a kitchen charcoal pot, containing a now rapidly dulling mass of rose-colored embers.